Hi, I'm Sanjena Sathian. I'm a writer and the author of the new novel Goddess Complex. You're listening to Trust Me, I Know What I'm Doing.
Yeah. My name is Abhay Dandekar, and I share conversations with talented and interesting individuals linked to the global Indian and South Asian community. It's informal and informative, adding insights to our evolving cultural expressions, where each person can proudly say, "Trust me, I know what I'm doing." Welcome, everybody, to this episode of Trust Me, I Know What I'm Doing. I don't know, delighted, thrilled, really ecstatic to see a second-time guest on the program. Let's welcome Sanjena Sathian once again to the program. Sanjena, thank you so much for joining us. What a treat.
Thanks for having me back. You were saying that I got to be in one of the first few episodes of the podcast, right? The first
Yeah,
time around.
yeah. And I mean, it's great to see now the sort of connect the dots from Gold Diggers to this. And Goddess Complex just came out. And I'm always very, very curious about how people sort of connect the dots on things. So was this at all, especially in thinking and conceiving Goddess Complex, was there an aha moment that really struck you as the birth of Goddess Complex? Was it at all related to serially going from Gold Diggers? I'm just curious how this idea for Goddess Complex was really born.
It was pretty halting, the birth of this thing. It was not a single bolt of inspiration. I started by I wanted to write about this relationship falling apart between two characters, and I was interested in a woman's experience of realizing that she is two versions of herself, and particularly how that can happen in the course of a relationship. And that was the sort of starting premise. Um, and I wrote about half the book from that premise, and then after I'd written 150 pages and actually sold 150 pages of the book to my publisher with a promise that I was halfway done and it would be another year and they would have the book, um, I realized that the project started on page 151. So that was kind of humbling. I realized
Yeah.
that I wasn't actually that interested in the particular dynamics of this relationship falling apart. I was going to have to rely on some kind of cheap tricks to make myself care about that relationship, make it feel surprising, because ultimately the
Mm.
book was leading to surprise, this guy's sort of shitty.
Yeah.
Um, which isn't that interesting because often we kind of, even though in life it can take us a long time to figure out when someone is trustworthy and when they aren't, when we're reading, the reader has the like privilege and comfort of being a little bit further away, and
Yeah.
can see things more clearly. So I felt like there was something almost condescending about what I was trying to do.
Mm.
And so I had to take a step back and realize, like, what was I interested in? It wasn't just the kind of universal experience of a relationship falling apart, but the very particular experience of a relationship falling apart over the discussion about whether or not to have children. And
Yeah.
that felt like a significantly riskier story to tell, because I think that our default assumption in a relatively pronatalist society, which is what we live in regardless of what JD Vance thinks, the
Right.
assumption is that if you have doubts about whether or not you want children, if you're ambivalent about parenthood or motherhood, or if you actively do not want it, there is something weird and wrong with you.
Yeah.
Um, and I realized that I had projected some of that onto the writing of the book itself. Like, I was very afraid to write a character who did not want children and who was actively coming to terms with that. And
Mm.
once I realized that that's what I was truly interested in writing about, the book then unfurled. And it became a story that was more about a woman in conversation with herself and not a woman in conversation with a man.
Yeah.
And that was a big realization. Was sort of the inception point.
And it sounds like, the idea of having a relationship based story, but then the evolution of how you were having that conversation with yourself and, in fact, sort of affirming a lot of the thoughts that you were having. Was this something that you had, conceived or even like thought about writing a while ago? But then, as you said, like this kind of took on its own life and really then developed after you had that aha moment of saying that, like, nope, this is not going to be your traditional story at all?
Yeah, I mean, Gold Diggers, for instance, is a book that I had been trying to write for like 12 years. It was the story that I had in me from my early 20s.
Yeah.
I started Goddess Complex in 2018, which now is a while ago.
Hmm.
And I put aside many versions of it.
Yeah.
Even before I got to that story, that version of the story that I was telling you about.
Yep.
I think I think really the thing that I needed to say was I often start, I think, by being interested in kind of a phase of life and how that phase of life for me personally fits into the zeitgeist, sort of the
Hmm.
personal zeitgeist of my friends and me, and then the larger kind of historical zeitgeist. And
Yeah.
with Gold Diggers, I wanted to write my way through kind of adolescence and early 20s. And Goddess Complex became this book that felt pretty urgent about your 30s and kind of a coming of age story
Yeah.
for one's 30s.
I, I I was thinking about sort of juxtaposing the two together, and that's going to be sort of the natural take that most people have after they've read Goddess Complex, to sort of like think about Gold Diggers as a backdrop to it. And yet, they're two very, very different links, at least for me as a reader. For me, if Gold Diggers was sort of like the first window into your world as a novelist, this seemed like being with you in a room full of 1,000 different mirrors and showing sort of like so many different character elevations and avatars and egos, and like you said, sort of like having this conversation with yourself. Was there any concentration that was sort of necessary to really sort of get all those specific voices to coalesce, or was it
Hmm.
important to, in fact, kind of like have different streams of thought and not necessarily have them coalesce into a binding story?
Um, I really like the image of mirrors. That's kind of a trippy, cool image. I don't know that it felt it's interesting. I think it almost felt the opposite for me compositionally. Like I think
Uh,
Gold Diggers felt like a massive, massive world and story with a lot of different characters. It spans a much longer period of time. It has multiple time jumps. You know, it opens in the 80s and then it jumps to the 2000s and then it jumps to the later 2010s and then there are these cutaways to the 1850s. This book, by contrast, the bulk of the action takes place, the present day action takes place in a single summer.
yeah.
Um, and the flashbacks basically only go as far as like a year or two, a few years earlier. Um, so it's actually kind of a much tighter project. And
Sure.
in that sense, it was harder to write that way because it's harder to work in tighter confines. But it was also helpful to say, actually, this is going to be a significantly more narrow project. It's
Hmm.
actually just going to be, it's primarily about one person, and I am placing faith that the reader will access a wider universal experience through one particular person.
Yeah.
Whereas I think with Gold Diggers felt a little more like what we might call a we novel. Um,
Yeah.
and this is an I novel.
Right.
And in that sense, it has some in common with kind of the auto fiction that became very popular in the 2010s, but it also makes a kind of meta turn. So it's really not auto fiction because it gets so bonkers. Um, but yeah, I think it
Which
actually
is a
the
very
game
apropos word after reading it. Yes.
um the the game for me was actually about kind of tightening and reducing and loosening. And I think it's about 20,000 words shorter than Gold Diggers. It's
Mm.
like it's a significantly shorter book.
I like that. The idea that like there are just so many. It's a really tight window of time, and therefore you have to compact so many things. And yet it doesn't feel like that. It feels like there's so many versions of you that are actually coming through, or so many versions of these characters that are coming through. There was a real sort of blend of speeds that I found to the story. Like there's sort of this careful patience in adding a lot of depth to a thought, and or a theme, and then this like sort of flowing description of a mood or a conversation, and then even sort of like this frantic urgency that you're sort of getting, especially in some places where the like sort of impulses are hitting you from many different angles. Um, Even though this was sort of a tight window of time, was that sort of an intentional calibration so that you could really portray millennial womanhood in your version as you wanted to tell it?
I think that pacing is something I think a lot about. And I think about pacing as like the essential thing that is required for me to move from one chapter to the next. Otherwise, I won't sustain my interest.
Yeah.
So in that
Which is
sense,
key, by the way, right? I mean,
yeah. And I say that to say, like, I think some writers think a lot about the reader's attention. And what's helpful for me is that I'm a reader who is bored easily. So I am my own reader who I'm testing against. And hopefully, if I've entertained myself, I just have to hope that I've entertained the reader as well.
yeah.
But um, yeah, I guess I would say that I the book's substance is about choice, right? It's about whether or not to have a child. We meet this woman who has recently left her husband, and she is grappling with her own decision to move away from the sort of prescribed path of parenthood. She went as far as to get pregnant and then have an abortion, having changed her mind relatively late into her pregnancy. And that that means that I had to think about, like, if you're pregnant, you think in terms of weeks. There is a ticking clock around days and weeks that means something. But also, if you are someone who is thinking about your sort of reproductive biological clock, I don't just tell you you're a physician, but the years become very weighted. The month by month sort of like cycles when people are going through IVF and like tracking their ovulation. Time is weird when you're trying to think
Yeah.
about reproduction. And so there were times when I needed to be thinking in terms of years flying by. And then there were times when I needed to be thinking in terms of like, there's a sort of freezing subplot where like the exact day that you start your cycle becomes really important. And when do you start the egg freezing cycle in relation to that? So I think the sort of substance dictated the pacing as was necessary.
I think of any book or artistic expression. It could be a musical piece. It could be sort of like, a speech you're giving. But in this case, of course, this artistic expression coming through your novel, that there's clearly a lot of, love and lots of other emotions involved, maybe angst, at the same time as you put something together like this. But, particularly for you personally, and as you mentioned, sort of like, this is a story and something that was being expressed as a part of your own evolution in a way. What parts of this book did you actually perhaps torment over?
Most of it. Yeah.
Was it really sort of like this tortuous like development for you? Like, this was really a tormenting process to get this out there.
I mean, I think that I say that partly facetiously, like the whole thing is kind of tortuous to eke out, but also, um, I think the book is semi-satirical. I hope people think it's funny. So as soon as I find a sense of humor in my pages, it is like it's not torture anymore, right? It's
Yeah.
still like breaking things down structurally. That is like torture and difficult, and it's hard to revise on a kind of plot level and make sure that everything fits and makes sense. But the kind of emotional life, I think a lot of the worst torture happened in the lead up to that like journey from the novel starts on page 151.
Mm,
It all for me, I think, was about finding play and being willing to be funny or irreverent or rude about things that people think we're supposed to treat with kind of total sacredness and sanctity.
yeah.
Um, so yeah, I think humor is the way out of that for me.
Of that torment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And with that, because humor and satire, are from the angle of you and your voice, and it's an angle of one in many cases, in order to pacify that torment a little bit. Is that a risk sometimes when you're writing? And on top of that, like, how is your ability to maybe take some of those risks changed as your experience as a writer has now, been cultivated and developed, and you have had success with, your first novel? I mean, have you approached risk taking from the angle of writing satire and humor particularly? Have you approached that any differently now this time?
I mean, I think that writing what I call semi-comic fiction, because I'm not writing hard satire, right? I'm not Paul Beatty, I'm not Percival Everett, whose work I love, but those people are hard satire. Like, the joke is the sole engine of, or the central engine of their work, and that helps
Sure.
them make big, sharp political points. I think for me, jokes are kind of part of the conceits of the novel. Like, in some ways, it's funny to say this is a book about a woman who does not want to have children, and the joke is she can't get away from her other self, who is so insistent on wanting children that she kind of gets chased down. So
Right.
that is a little bit of a joke. Like, the doppelganger conceit is fundamentally funny, I think. But I think that my ultimately, like, the humor for me lives in the voice and in the character's
Mm.
consciousness.
Yeah.
So in that sense, like, it's not really a risk because I don't have a choice, because the character is who she is. My characters are the way they are. My voice is what it is. So if I don't write that way, I won't write well. And I've tried to write other ways. The flip side, the thing that's, I think, hard to wrap your brain around, like, now at this stage when I'm putting the thing into the world, is I think sometimes a lot of contemporary fiction is, like, incredibly humorless and, like, incredibly sanctimonious. And if you try to be funny, there is a risk that you will be taken less seriously, that people won't
Mm.
see the sort of social and political substance of the project, and that they won't treat it as much of a literary object. That is, like, a hard, frustrating thing, and it's not something that I can control. It's also
Right.
interesting because, like, I think literarily, Gold Diggers got treated. People called it a satire, like, the novel was a satire, which it's not. It is, I think, it's semi-comic, but people
Yeah.
called it kind of firmly a comedy. And then I came to Hollywood, and we were working on the adaptation, and it's firmly a drama in Hollywood.
Mm.
So it's a drama with some comedic elements, but, like, that just, I think, goes to show you that the language we use to categorize art in the marketplace is pretty flawed. Um,
Yeah.
and
True.
separating the comedic from the dramatic is often kind of fruitless, and just says more about us as audiences and our inability to meet projects in their fullness. Like, when I teach, I often tell students, like, having a sense of humor is not, it's not an extra thing. Like, if your work is devoid of humor, that to me is as bad as your work being devoid of an emotional life. It is,
Mm.
humor is part of,
Sure.
like, the palette of human existence. And if you don't have access to that as a writer, I think you're not going to be a very good writer.
What's funny is that, I read Percival Everett's James literally just before I read Goddess Complex. And so, the idea of this and the emotions that they lead up to, and what's your sort of, I guess, gradation of humor or satire, that definitely does matter on your own, on the reader's mood as well. I mean, just that I'm personally speaking, and I'm in no way, shape, or form someone who's an avid reader, or I have a lot of experience with this, and there's some naivete there. But I think you're right that, like, if you're void of some grade of humor, then that's at least a challenge. There was one line that I remember reading in the book where Sanjena is at the therapist, or with her therapist, and she very contemplatively shares that I don't regret being myself. And that line sort of struck me a little bit, in that I wonder, how do you think that particular reflection, if at all, somehow is very specific and resonant for the millennial South Asian woman and her experience, particularly in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, that's a complex sentiment in the book because there's a later point where she does kind of say the opposite. She says, actually, I wish I could be a different person. And that desire to be a different person ends up taking her down a few different other very strange paths.
Right.
I think that, but I think you're right to say that that's like one of the central kind of concerns of the book. Um, I think that if we broadly talk about many elements of South Asian and South Asian American society as leaning towards the collectivist. And I put a big asterisk here because I make fun of the tendency to generalize our culture this way in the book
Right.
because it is it is silly to act as though we are a monolith. But
Yeah,
um,
totally.
with that asterisk, when you do have social values that tend towards the communal, there is a natural and necessary erasure of the individual.
Mm.
And that very often I think it affects all of us. Like my first book was about in many ways how that erased the experience of a teenage boy and a young man. I think that that happens maybe to an additional or more specific degree to women who are expected to be the sort of like bearers of tradition. Like I often think about the fact that many, and I'm going to talk here kind of specifically about Indian American women and particularly kind of like dominant caste Hindus. Um, for women like us, the expectation is that we will carry the traditional values from the motherland into the diaspora. So
Yeah.
many of us, when we're kids, were sent off to dance classes and kind of to learn the sort of tradition and the culture. And it is a little less common for boys to be given that same degree of expectation.
Mm.
Um, then that becomes kind of even more intense when you reach your 20s and 30s and people are expecting and hoping that you will marry and enter a heterosexual, heteronormative union that will produce babies.
Right.
Those are, and I don't want to generalize to you, so you should tell me if you disagree, but I
No,
think
no.
that.
I mean, I have a follow-up thought to this one. Like you said, the asterisk is there, and I'll even make the asterisk even wider. Sort of prelogue or a prologue to this question, and that is that as you're going through this, I'm thinking like, well, in the same way, like for men who are reading the book, what should their reflection on that takeaway, be? For that matter, the Manishas of the world who are reading the book, what should their takeaway be? I mean, there's so many different ways that those readers can actually filter what they read and sort of transpose it or not onto their own experience as well. And I'm just curious, like, as you're saying all these things, particularly like these are actually important ways to look at the world from the South Asian American or the Indian American vantage point. But I'm just curious if that at all factored into as you're writing this, and even as now you're reflecting on this as the book is coming out and as people are reading it, are those being magnified in any way, especially as different people are reading it from their own lens?
Yeah, I am starting. Because the book isn't officially. We're talking a week before it comes out. I
Yeah.
haven't heard from that many readers yet, but I have heard from a handful of early readers, and it's really interesting to hear from male readers who I think men are protected from understanding like how babies arrive in the world. And I don't just mean the biological process, I mean the social process.
Yeah.
I have a lot of male friends who are progressive, thoughtful feminists who still did not really realize until they had female partners and they began negotiating when or whether they were going to have children with those partners. They did not understand what it took, what the emotional and internal cost for those female partners was going to be. And like that makes me angry. Like there
Mm.
is a degree of anger that I think is in the pages of the book because it just sucks and is really unjust that
Yeah.
only half the population has to think about this and how deeply we have to think about this. Like I think a lot of men just believe that babies arrive spontaneously and they don't understand what kinds of internal negotiations their often female partners have to go through to bring those children into the world, and they don't understand why it might not be a choice that those people want to make. And so I have heard recently, I heard from someone who now has an adorable, lovely baby. And he told me, that baby almost didn't exist because he and his wife were stuck in these debates for several years. And they
Yeah,
didn't really tell anyone. They didn't have anyone to discuss it with. It felt, I think he didn't say this, but I wondered if there was a degree of shame around the fact that there were disagreements at all.
sure.
And so I think to get to your question, like, if there's anything I'm interested in, it's the fact that there is a choice and that there are infinite myriad choices that go into whether or not we procreate and reproduce. And I think that's true that the larger kind of societal culture in America we all need to question that, and we all need to have a discussion about that. And then there are particularities to the South Asian community where we really need to check about why we don't have a relationship to those many choices. And the last thing I'll say is, I wrote a critical essay a few years ago about several novels that were kind of about reproductive choice, and
Mm.
I read a book of literary criticism by a male scholar who was writing about kind of procreative choice in the history of the novel, and he said he was sort of tracing things from D.H. Lawrence to Doris Lessing to contemporary like Sheila Heti and writers like that. And there was a degree of scorn in his scholarship where he was sort of
Mm.
like, why are we so obsessed with whether or not to have children? Why are people so skeptical? Like, babies bring new life. Like, we should be interested in the question of new life.
Sure.
And he explicitly at one point in the scholarship says he doesn't think that, or he wonders whether the kind of waffling about reproduction is sufficient material for a novel, which I found such a wild thing to say and
Yeah,
such an ignorant thing to say, because it suggests that, like, if this man has children, like, I don't want to know what's going on in terms of like
right.
what negotiations happened in that life, because it is a full rich phase of choosing. Like, you become yourself as you make the choices you make in arranging a life and arranging an adulthood. And procreation or not procreating is part of that choice, and it shapes us.
No, absolutely. And I mean, this book certainly made me think a little bit and along those parallel lines of, when my wife and I were having those discussions. And I wonder for you, as you were going through both the writing and now honestly the reflection process, and that'll happen more and more as more and more readers, give you feedback about it. But, what do you think you perhaps learned or have gained in the writing process, but particularly at that intersection of fertility and reproduction from the immigrant vantage point? Because basically a lot of this is a little bit complicated or perhaps magnified, or a different version of this is happening for those who are part of the immigrant family process or children of the immigrant family process, just because of all the other baggage and burdens that are placed on many of those families. As you rightfully said, that many women are supposed to be bearing that sort of responsibility of the culture at the same time. So, I mean, was there a learning process for you that, particularly from that immigrant vantage point, has taken on new life, especially?
Yeah, I mean, I think the kind of first order assumptions we have about South Asian immigrant families are what I said initially. Like, there is a burden to carry on tradition, and so naturally that burden to carry on tradition will live in like the bloodline. And so for a lot of families, that is true. You are
Yeah,
expected to procreate because it is part of the sort of like social values. And resisting that can be a resistance to the wider social values. I will say the more I wrote and had conversations with members of my community, including my family, the more I understood how much texture there is within this kind of seemingly monolithic experience.
mm,
Like, I think a lot of times when I mention, like, I'm probably not going to have kids, people say, oh, is that like, what does your mom say? Like, you have an immigrant mom.
right.
They must be really upset about that. And the truth is, my mother was actually one of the first people to be incredibly supportive of that decision. When I told her, I was around 27 or 28 when I said, I think I'm leaning against, she was like, yeah, totally get it. Like,
Right.
she worked outside the home. She had kind of a very strong identity outside of motherhood, even though motherhood was important to her. And I think part of the reason that she had that other identity was because even though it's very common for immigrants to say, like, we came here for a better life for our children, they also came here for a better life for themselves. And part of a better life for herself was to have an identity that was not just being an Indian woman, Indian wife, Indian mother. Like, she came here
Yeah.
because she wanted more. And part of having more was being more than just a mother, in addition to however much motherhood mattered to her. And so, actually, there were things that were innate to her experience as an immigrant that I think made her actually very understanding of this choice. And so,
Yeah.
if people read this and kind of are having their own tortured relationship with their own immigrant families, I would just encourage them to think kind of more expansively and curiously about what the immigrant experience might mean in all of its textured variations, because it is as
Yeah.
varied as like there are people.
No, and I love that. I mean, I do think that we often do, I wouldn't say ignore, but we definitely, tend to sweep under the rug the value of self when it comes to the immigrant experience, as opposed to just simply the communal version of it. I also I'm always curious about whenever there's, any kind of expression about balance measures, and hear me out in this. I'm trying to equate sort of the way we look at quality improvement in healthcare to what this actually is. And I don't know if there's a true link here, but just, bear with me on this one. There just are a lot of really sort of complex and challenging things about being an Indian American woman in her 30s. And the book certainly speaks to revealing so much of that. And it speaks with some tight satire, about all of this, which is really refreshing and welcome, of course. But, you know, out of all those things that are so complex and difficult, and actually curiosities and questions that we really should be asking from this, are there some things that became clarified as to how simple or easy, or the things that are assumed or maybe even taken for granted or even privileged about the experience of being a late 20 something or 30 something South Asian American or Indian American woman, to pose these questions in the first place, or to be able to have that agency to be able to do so? Was there anything that is equally a balance measure to reveal there?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I do think privilege is important to talk about anytime we talk about the Indian American diaspora, because as a group we skew so privileged. And something I was thinking a lot, this may not be an exact answer to your question, but something I was thinking a lot about as I wrote the book
I'm not sure, by the way,
is
my question has an exact answer in the first place. So,
um well, so the book is about reproductive choice, but if we zoom out and remember what that phrase means and where it comes from, the phrase actually has gotten a lot of criticism because it comes out of second wave movements of relatively well off feminists who are saying, like, having choice means the right to say no, the
yeah,
right to refuse to have a child. And Black feminists for several generations have said that that is too narrow and too privileged of a framework for thinking about uh, kind of childbearing and reproduction. And actually, we need this larger framework of reproductive justice, which includes the right to have a child if that is what you want. And
yeah,
that comes out of a history of being like forcibly sterilized and having children taken away from you by the state, and having your parenting policed and judged. And so one thing that is, I think, like, I have thought a lot about, and the book is often kind of, it is primarily about the experience of one single woman whose internal battle is to control her own body. But I have thought a lot about how that fits into this larger kind of framework of reproductive justice. And the book is just one narrow literary object. It can't represent all of those views, but I hope
sure.
that if people consume it, they understand that it fits into this like larger category that is important if we're going to understand liberation, which is kind of a political project that exists outside of the book and is something that we need to think about and talk about right now, because the actual kind of right to choose is imperiled, but also implicated in the right to choose are the right to choose whether or not to have an abortion are all of these other rights that relate to reproductive justice, like access to fertility care for people who do want to have children,
Right.
um, and access to third-party forms of parenting like surrogacy for queer couples. So I don't know, it all kind of fits in. Like, I think if you start by feeling kind of narrowly defensive about choice, which is where I started, you can lose that it's kind of part of this larger struggle. And understanding that it's part of this larger struggle is very freeing, because it means that you can connect your personal desires or aversions to other people's that are very varied. And that was kind of a journey that
Mm.
I went on politically, but also like emotionally. Does that make sense?
It totally does. Yeah. And I mean, I think the naivete of saying that this is a position of privilege without actually, digging a little deeper, and understanding some of those nuances, and then the sort of political intricacies of it. We talked about J.D. Vance in the beginning of this, which, I'm sort of, never apt to try and do, but the idea of this is actually really important, I think, to analyze in that way. And I'm so glad that you brought that up. In thinking about that, and maybe some of the other, grapplings that you had to do in writing this, both from the vantage point of a writer and, for that matter, as a Indian American, what did you actually have to unlearn about yourself in order to write this book?
That's a beautiful question. What did I have to unlearn? Well, I think first I had to unlearn some shame around my own desires and aversions. I had to learn that it was okay to not want things that the world tells me I should want. But then, second order, I had to learn that my own kind of coming to terms with my own desires did not preclude me from connecting with other people's very different desires. Like, I think the book itself is a journey from someone who has to be fiercely protective and defensive of her own body, because there are people, like, she is in a marriage where someone really wants her to be pregnant, and she has to kind of physically save herself from that, because that is not what she wants. But
Right.
then her kind of defensiveness and protectiveness causes her to close down from the world. And the journey is, I think, a little bit of her opening up to the world again. And I think that's kind of a journey that I went on while writing the book as well, is going from kind of a position of like crouched defensiveness to a position of curiosity about other people's experiences in addition to my own. And a lot of the people who, a friend of mine who read the book, Roshni Chokshi, who is a young adult and middle grade author, and also writes some some adult fiction. She read the book when her daughter had been born like 4 weeks earlier. She had like a baby strapped to her chest when she was reading this book that was all about
Right.
how this person doesn't want a baby. And I
Yeah.
was incredibly nervous. And she was so unbelievably generous. And it helped me understand that actually, I think we sometimes, particularly women, act as though like one person's experience crowds out another. And there's a
Mhm.
reason for that, which is if two people are pregnant and one person thinks that what they are carrying is a baby and to end that pregnancy is to end a life, and someone else feels exactly the opposite, like those are two competing interpretations of the same experience. And that is dangerous. And we do have to be protective in the face of that. But
Yeah.
also, having multiple kind of forms of language around the same experience, if you can reach it from kind of a place of abundance, is very freeing. And having people like Roshni read the book and be generous in response, I think, helped me see how clearly articulating one experience of the world can actually open up space for a lot more kinds of experience. Maggie Nelson in The Argonauts writes that it's not really the language of it's a choice or it's a child. It's a choice and a child, and we all know that.
Yeah.
And she's not saying like literally that you are pregnant with a baby and to end that that pregnancy is to kill it. She is saying more largely that like both of those things can be true, and we have to have kind of social, emotional, and political frameworks that can make space for both of those things.
Yeah, whether it's, thoughts or ideas or people, right? I mean, they don't have to be constantly competing with each other. And this notion that there are many, many different parallel lanes that can be true at the same time, I think is so important. And I think of that when I particularly am thinking of all the different avatars in this book that struck me, right? Whether that's Sanjena Sathian, whether that is Sunny, whether that is Sanjena Satyananda, Killian and Kalyan, and all of these very different, sort of playful avatars, if you will, being kind of small little, again, mirrors or expressions that come about in that book. When you say that this is all sort of a conversation that you're having, is it everyone's version of that great book called You're Your Own Worst Frenemy? Is that just sort of like the constant conversation that many of us seem to be having in sort of curating all of these different egos or avatars?
Yeah, maybe. I think you're right. Yeah, we're all, what I meant when I said that it's an I book, I don't mean, I hope it doesn't feel like a selfish book, because actually I think
Mm.
there is something really interesting about examining the self as kind of a multifaceted and multiplicitous thing. We all contain many selves, and being in touch with all of those is a really interesting way to not just like be in better touch with ourselves, but also be in better touch with kind of a wider society. It's almost like that's kind of the practice of like a Buddhist compassion meditation, is to understand how the many selves that you contain in your own identity and ego are the many selves of the world. And if you can be empathetic to all of them, you can be empathetic to more people.
I'll get you out of here on this. And I asked you this last time as well, but I'm so curious, particularly now that this, next expression is out there in Goddess Complex. But how will this book change the way you live your life and maybe even how you grow as a writer?
I mean, I think it loosened some of my own anxieties and expectations around my 30s, which is something that I think, like, if Gold Diggers helped me almost like exercise some of my stuff around achievement and ambition culture, this has helped me work through some of my own thoughts and feelings about childbearing. And so I feel looser. I feel more at peace with my own decisions. And then as a writer, I mean, making it through a sophomore novel is like a big milestone. People often say that it is the hardest. So I have no idea if that's true. It would be great if that's true. Um, but I do feel like I do feel I'm working on some new stuff that I'm not ready to talk about yet, except to say that I feel more agile as a
Mm.
writer. So yeah, not going to.
Well, feeling more agile as a writer, getting more agility as a reader, I think it's all very appreciated. And of course, readers are going to be continuing to tap into the Sanjenaverse, as they say, one page at a time. And I'm certainly enjoying the ride for sure. So if everyone can, Goddess Complex is, am I getting this right? Okay, here we go. Goddess Complex, and really such a treat to visit with you again. I hope we can do so again down the road. Sanjena, thank you so, so much. This was really, really a special conversation, and best of luck with everything.
Thanks for having me back. It was really fun.
You're listening to Trust Me, I Know What I'm Doing. Stay tuned.